And what we're listening to in the background is part of a chronometer, which I did with Harrison Birtwistle. And it just came out last year as the first quad sound classical music piece. So it's released as a DVD with an ordinary CD sound on one side and quad on the other.
Could you explain in layman's terms what quad sound is?
It means quadraphonic. This piece was designed I made it with Birtwistle in about 1970. And you'll see later in the slides what the studio looked like then. But it was made as a quadraphonic piece, so it's one of the first quadraphonic pieces. This is only being played in stereo now. But it was a milestone that the original recording was found last year and then made into this DVD.
What was it recorded on?
I suppose it was recorded on 4-track Ampexes and perhaps as 8-track Studer.
And how would you have to set up a system if you want to play it in like pre-Dolby 5.1 kind of scenarios, that sort of environment?
Well, a lot of luck, but it was actually under computer control. So the sync was done with computer control. And in fact, Ray Dolby lived down the road from where my studio was, and he gave us his prototypes to use before he was a household name.
Okay, there's maybe about 5 people in this room who actually might remember Dolby. That's like the sign that kind of helped your tapes to like have less noise, right?
Yeah, it's on every film.
Yeah. So there's an actual person by that name.
He's called Ray Dolby, yeah. He's like Bob Moog. I mean, or is it Charles Hoover who invented the...
Right, yeah. So when you say that it was done with computer help in 1970, I remember in about 76, when I was very, very little, my dad was working in the military and he brought this thing home and he's like, son, this is a computer and it will help us play a board game because it's got 6 LED lights and it will be our dice. And I'm like, why? Like, wouldn't it be a lot easier to have just roll the dice and not use this thing?
Well, my first computer was much before that, was I think 1964 or something like that, perhaps even earlier. It was a digital equipment, PDP-8, and it was the first computer in a private house in the world.
That
so
sounds
I
like
have had a computer longer than anybody in the world. That's very good, isn't it? And talking about random numbers, it's not very easy to get a computer to play dice. It's very difficult because what often happens is that the series of numbers which comes out, you can recognize it as repetitive. So what I did in those days was to have a luminous watch and a Geiger counter, and it recorded the spontaneous radioactivity, and from that we derived random numbers, and that was true randomness.
Excuse my ignorance, but why would you have a Geiger counter in your house?
Because it's very difficult to get random numbers. It was purely to get random numbers. It's almost impossible to make a mathematical function which will give a non-repetitive series. Yeah.
Okay, that probably helps as far as, because I was wondering at the same time when I found the same unit again, like 20 years later, and I was in the basement, and I was like, hang on, it's got 6 LEDs, but the manual was like at least double that volume. I'm like, what did they teach them with that? Like, I mean, like.
Well, you were lucky. Nowadays, it's terrible. There's never a manual. So, you have to look at PDF files, and it's only on the last page you want to find out what you want to find out. Days of manuals were wonderful.
But manuals were not like very helpful as far as context or text word search were, right?
Well, it's only nowadays that people can't turn pages fast. So you have books on, it's a ridiculous idea to have a book where you say next page, and then you want to go to page 5, and you don't know if it's page 5 or 50. It's terrible. Anyway.
Yeah, I mean,
Anyone agree?
all the manual labor that goes into like flicking the page. So.
It's terrible, yeah.
I can see that. Now, but still, I mean, we're talking about a time when I'd say the greater majority of the public doesn't even know what a computer is. How does one end up in your home?
Because I had a marvelous engineer called David Cockrell, who's probably will go down as the best electronic music engineer that's ever been. And he had the great gift that, I suppose I had the great gift of thinking of something that I wanted, and I'd ring him up, and he'd make it. However difficult it was, he'd make it. And then one day he said, the only way to control this multitude of oscillators, amplifiers, tape recorders, whatever it was, huge array, you'll see a slide of it in a bit, of equipment. He said, the only way to control this is to have a computer. And the computers in those days were used in factories just for this sort of thing. Turn that on, turn that off, switch this. And that's how it was first of all used, as a process control thing.
And obviously you did not go to an online shop or just somewhere down a high street. Like, where would you obtain the parts for it? And
well, there was a company called Digital Equipment Corporation in America. And I remember very well, when I bought it, they offered a course to go and learn how to use it. At the end of the course, I had no idea what I could do. Absolutely none. It was used, the course was for people who already used computers in a sort of massive way with decks of cards, and it was, I had no idea. So I said to him, I'll give you a case of whiskey if you can tell me how I could control an oscillator. And he said, TAD-I Auto. Now, TAD-I Auto, in the language of that computer, meant take a number, put it somewhere, then go back and take the next number, which will be the next in the stack, and give it. And just by that, I realized that you could take numbers sequentially and give them to an oscillator so the sound would change. And it was worth that conversation, the case of whiskey for TAD-I Auto.
what sort of whiskey was it? Did he share some of that whiskey with you? I mean, obviously... No? Okay.
It left.
So that was your eureka moment right there.
It was, exactly.
And I mean, just to give us some perspective, I mean, that's just one information at a time, which is just one notch on whatever information parameter is changing on the oscillator. So you would have to do exactly that operation a lot of times, right?
Thousands of times a second, yes, to make a piece like this. Because this piece was you just pressed a button, go, and the whole piece came out. So it was very amazing, really.
So what were you doing at the time when you said, like, oh, I got all these things and I want to do this?
Well, originally I was a geologist, and that's why this talk is called Geology and Music. So, and also, by the way, in the middle part is I was also a librettist for Harrison Birtworth and wrote the libretto for The Mask of Orpheus, the big opera.
Would probably, could you enlighten us what a librettist does?
Libretto writes the scenario and the words, the plot, the play, and then the composer writes the music. So this was a very big opera. And the point of this talk is to show that exactly the same thought processes perhaps go on, whether you're a geologist making a map, whether you're a writer doing a libretto, or whether you're a composer doing computer music or electronic music. And so, although it seems a wild idea, I hope at the end you'll see that actually I use the same triangles in all of these different disciplines.
Probably before we jump into this, so that people would get a bit of, actually I think you're getting there as well, like your involvement with a certain company that we might know these days. It's part of
EMS.
the presentation as well, right?
Well, I brought along a very old Synthi, a prototype for a Synthi A. And the company, well, I had this computer music studio, and the only way we could finance it was by selling synthesizers. So the studio wasn't financed by the government or anything else. So we made these synthesizers, and they were the bread and butter for what I thought the more important work. And I never used them. I really feel shy about putting a pin in. So fortunately, it's been set up now, and we'll have a lovely demonstration of it later, and anybody can play with this. But as I say, it's like a museum piece. And extraordinarily enough, people are wanting these old analog synthesizers more and more now. I mean, I can't imagine why, really, because it's so amazing what one can do with actual computers now. It's not my world.
Yeah, so the whole fetish.
If you want, fetish?
Yeah, the whole fetish of these machines is kind of alien to you then.
It is, because my whole philosophy at the beginning was to do away with cutting tape, which was how one made electronic music at first, slicing tape and sticking it together with sellotape, roughly. And this seems such a terrible idea. So that's how I developed the idea of sequencer. And this reminds me a bit of tape days, you know, taking a pin, putting it somewhere, hoping there's a sound, turning a level up, it not being exactly accurate. But there are lots of people who disagree with me over that.
There was somewhere in a buy note you just mentioned, and that's when you worked on a sequencer, right?
Yes.
Okay. Now, sequencers, I guess, are like our very foundation for what most of us do in like digital audio platforms.
Yes.
Just like that, right?
Yeah, it's to have one sound after another sound. So the first sequencer which I made was based on a uniselector, which is how old-fashioned telephones worked. You dialed a number, and as the dial went back, it would go pip, 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 pip. And so there were more pip-ups for bigger the number. So a naught had the maximum number, and then a one only had one beep. And so at the exchange, this was a sequence of numbers which came in, and it would recognize the sequence of numbers and connect you to the right telephone. And that was exactly what I used. And the first sequence I made was using telephone technique like that. And these relays would go around making these shuttering noises and would switch on and off different oscillators. And I think that was the first sequencer in the world.
When did you hear about other people working on similar concepts?
I didn't believe anybody was working on anything like it. And then, by chance, I met Max Matthews at Bell Labs. Yeah. And he was doing exactly similar work with a program called Groove. Yeah. And then, after we'd done these synthesizers, who should turn up but somebody called Moog or Moog or something like this in America? Never heard of him. We thought he must have copied us. And so it was very strange working in parallel, but unknown to each other.
Well, I guess those of us who were around, which is probably two people in this room, if I see correctly, I don't know, but I mean, it was a common thing to just play with, annoy the fuck out of your parents or grandparents and just play with the telephone, because that relay sound was just so beautiful in a way. So it was like a similar fascination.
Well, the best thing was it was called phone phreaking, wasn't it? Yeah. Where you could tap the number you wanted to and avoid the exchange. And the ultimate phone freak was to tap enough so that it would go to satellite to satellite to satellite and come back to you with a noise like this. And then you knew you'd gone round the world 25 times and you were successful. That was the goal.
So when you said you more or less just did it out of necessity, and all of a sudden you heard about the Moogs of this world, when did you realize that there was actually enough in there to maybe make a living out of it, or just at least turn it into like a business venture?
Oh, well, I think we did it at the same time, or before Moog we started. And at one point we nearly bought him up. He nearly went broke, and then we just couldn't afford it. I wish we had, from a commercial point of view. But he had a completely different... He once came when we made this, or actually the VCS3, and he came and he sat on the floor in my studio, and he thought it was marvelous, you know, and we couldn't, because the idea of leads was even worse than cutting up tape, you know, to actually have a lead connecting from one place, like we've got here. They still exist It's extraordinary. In a few years, we won't have these. I mean, Wi-Fi
That's
will
what we
be
all
much,
hoped
much
if we ever
better.
cabled something. So with the VCS and all, I mean, that these things are very, very sought after now, and but they never, weirdly enough, got the same sort of recognition. Was that because you never had like the major business partner backing you up in a similar way as some of the Americans had?
Well, it's partly that. It's partly that when they were just taking off and doing very well, we were going to go public in America, and then my company, EMS, got cheated by the Americans, by our American partners, and gave us a duff check, and then the company collapsed. It was a very sad story, really, because once we couldn't sell these machines, then the studio had to collapse. And the studio was actually taken over by the National Theatre here in London, and they cut up. At that time, it was huge, hundreds and hundreds of leads connecting everything. You'll see it in one of the pictures. And they put it in the basement leaked, and the last time I saw it, all this equipment was covered with exercise bicycles and water. So it was a terrible, terrible thing. A few of the Ampexes survived, but that was the end of it. Disgraceful story.
Is that the same place that you talk about? Because I don't know how these things end up online, but we found a diary from 1976 where you talk about rain coming into.
Oh no, that was into my studio. Yes, that was a computer arts magazine. I don't know how it got online. I mean, it was extraordinary, but that was a day in the busy life, a week in the busy life of my studio. Then, yes.
Do you recall that moment? Because there's a great analogy about this movie and when the Tatars took over this church or monastery.
Oh, that's right. What was it called? Rublev was the name of a film. And after these Tatars come and sack the whole town and everything, and Rublev, who was the greatest icon painter of what?
Tarkovsky film, Andrei Tarkovsky.
Yes. And then in this great cathedral, which had been burnt down, and he says, it's very sad when it rains in a cathedral. And it was like that. It was very sad when it rained on my studio.
So yeah, I guess we got a bit of context so that we can actually start what you really were going to talk about, but so people wouldn't go like, where are we?
All right. I must explain a bit about this. Unfortunately, some of the slides don't seem to work, and I'll try and skip them on. And also, I don't seem to be able to get this. This is a new laptop of mine, and don't seem to be able to liaise it properly. So I have to do the presentation directly from there. That's all right. But there'll be a few hiccups. And also, anyone interrupt at any point, and I'll stop, and, it's not, this is meant to be light entertainment. All right? So shall I start? Or are there any questions at the moment? No? Okay. All right, so here, I'm saying that science, a geological map, and a libretto, and electronic composition were three lucky involvements of mine, all completely different, but they were very lucky. Does it go on or not? No.
Let go. Let go. No, someone. Are you anyone else? Let go. Let go. No. Let me. I'm going to give you the last three from right to the redemption tango.
This is a synthesized voice, possibly one of the first big synthesized voices of a crofter in the northwest of Scotland telling a story. So here is where the crofter was. This is a steamer. There's the Isle of Skye opposite. And note, as I said, the tidal shore, where the tide goes up and down. That whole area was a wonderful, wonderful volcano. About 30 million years ago, in the tertiary volcanic, it was in the tertiary times. This is what it looks like now. And this is when I was at Oxford doing a doctorate. This was the area which I had to map. In those days, I had a band with a biscuit tin, and that came to the closest to electronic music. But that was a long time ago. So here's another view of what the... And I stayed in this bothy there, and I mapped these mountains. And that's what climbing was like in those days. So it shows how long ago it was.
Is that you?
Yeah, it is, yeah. And I was interested in music then, as you can see, and I had my own synthesizer when I was camping. And we used to, I mapped it onto aerial photographs and then analyzed the rocks, finding little details. For instance, here there are various layers, just like in a musical composition. So I'd analyze those. I'd look in the tiny bits of the crystals, and I'd find different peculiarities like sampling. This is very similar to sampling. And here, more and more detail of what... I'll play a piece later which will show how this works in what I'm doing at the moment. And the scale of everything is completely important in geology. You know, are you dealing with big or little things? And each of those contributes to the whole. And the structure, which is like a composition, here is the structure of the actual chemical structure of a rock. And here is the structure of an ultimate computer music piece, which says, please make me a beautiful composition to a computer. And here is a structure of Act 3. Now you'll see that each of these things looks very similar. There's the structure of a crystal. There's the ultimate computer composition with things like tension, surprise, dependency, randomness, all in there. And there is the structure of the third act of a libretto. And there is the final geological map. So that's the end of the geology bit.
She takes him in her arms, and then, lying at full length, she kisses his face and lips, and clasps him tightly to her. Then,
So at the bottom,
For the
was my
non-native speakers, what's a whippet?
that was my studio down at the bottom there, overlooking the Thames.
Whippet is a dog.
Yeah.
Dies thus at his side.
So this was a very, very exciting piece which I did, Tristan with Hans Werner Henze. It was wonderful, from whipping the piano with whips to wonderful Italian meals. It was a terrific adventure for me.
How
It was
did the
really
Italian
wonderful.
meals get in there?
Because Henze brought over his assistant Fausto, who cooked all these meals, and it was a month or two of wonderful times.
Doesn't sound too bad. And LSO stands for, or maybe you want to
London
pause this for a
Symphony
second.
Orchestra.
Yeah.
Okay, so this is recording the clocks of chronometer. So this is in the Science Museum, the Wells clock. And then we went up to the top of Big Ben and recorded all the different little mechanisms in Big Ben. It was...
Oh, can you actually enlighten us if you pause this for a second? One thing that we noticed is
Wait.
when you go past churches here, they seem to be terribly out of tune, or at least like, yeah, not like a good German church bell.
The bells, you mean?
Yeah,
The tuning of the bells is weird.
yeah, and they play like really weird, like off rhythms, like.
It might be guys actually doing it with ropes rather than a mechanism doing it. That might be the difference.
You think so?
I don't. I think you're wrong. I think this is bell ringing proper here. Perhaps.
It's a tintantabulation or whatever the expression is. Isn't it a huge long word for ringing bells?
Oh well, I mean, might just ask, but I figured like from clocks to bells. It was
Right. This is a video which doesn't work.
The programs which operate the computer.
So
Really in the future, it's how inspired people are going to be in using them, not in what the computers can do.
So the point of this was a wonderful exhibition called Cybernetic Serendipity. And in this point, I was able to, people came along and whistled into the computer. The computer would analyze the whistle and often guess what the person was going to whistle next. So I took several of the most popular things which people would whistle. And then the computer, this a massive great thing, would make tunes like this out of the whistles. This was a very, very important advance in robot electronic music, and it's still talked about. It was a real milestone, this exhibition in 1970 of cybernetic
and you could do the same
serendipity.
thing with a pianola. You could just punch holes
What?
at random and get sounds out. But people weren't very frightened
Yes.
by this idea. Basically, there's a computer, and this operates.
So I'm going to go on because it's not playing for some reason. So
Were these computers fully transistorized or were they still full of valves?
transistors.
They were
Yeah, someone could actually repair a module of memory. And they would, you know, each. I tell you, this computer, which was half the size of a wall behind me, really, I suppose, with 3 racks of it, had 8K of memory. And in the end, we got a 32K hard drive, which was huge. And we never thought we could fill it. And it was 32K. And on this little computer here, I've got 4 gigabytes of memory, and I've got half a terabyte of disk space. I mean, the difference between that, 8K, to this 4 gigabytes is completely amazing. That computer cost a fortune, a real fortune. And this one cost 300 and something pounds. So
Did you have any sort of benefactors to come up with those fortunes?
I did. We'll come to that in a bit. This was one of the first studios I built. So there were quite a lot of leads.
Mini computer was the first. Well, it was the first cheap computer, but cheap at that time was £5,000, which was not at all cheap in terms. Well, it was as much as a house.
I was lucky in those days to have a rich wife, and so we sold her tiara and we swapped it for a computer. And this was the first computer in the world in a private house.
Yeah, I told you.
Putney, where Peter Zinovieff has a hobby which is strictly for boffins. He keeps it in his garden shed, and it's called Digital PDP 8/S. Yes, it's a computer, and it has a hobby too, composing music. Peter helps with the ideas, but the actual performance is all Digital's work.
And digital computers were already used in process control in factories. That's exactly what we wanted. We wanted a process control for different sounds so that one would follow another or a combination of them would be heard together.
He wanted to make, well, innovative music, sounds that nobody had made before.
Peter Zinovieff was using computers in a way that would become commonplace in the mid-80s. He was doing this almost 20 years earlier with equipment that was large and unwieldy, not designed for the purpose. And he and his co-engineers were developing things that had never been even considered up to that point, let alone considered possible.
Those were oscillators.
Many of the things that Peter did were really quite advanced, and one of them was sampling. He made the first sampler that I know of anywhere in the world.
That's David
The
Cochrane.
trouble with sampling is that to get a sound which sounds the same as what you put in requires a huge lot of information.
So the whole of his computer's memory, which was about 8,000 characters, was occupied with storing this little fragment of sound.
It was at the cutting edge, and neither the people who came nor ourselves knew what we could do with this apparatus.
I remember once Karl-Heinz Stockhausen came, and they collaborated for quite a while and spent a long time making a box the size of a fridge, which was insulated from a sound point of view, so that they could record the sound of a fly
Screeching. Actually eating a lump of sugar. It was meant to be. So that's David Cockrell looking at.
So that was part of like a longer documentary program that's pretty much available online as well. Right? Yeah. So if anyone's interested.
This is the rain which we're talking about falling onto my computer.
Which piece did you work with Stockhausen on?
Wasn't a piece. He just came and fiddled around, really.
As he does.
This is how the studio gradually developed into something much smarter than that. These are my 3 children, and this was an advertisement for the future of opera. I didn't at this stage know that I would be involved in an opera. And we made all these crazy advertisements. Every picnic needs a Synthi. And every body needs a Synthi, every band.
I mean, that's like ultimate triple X for most of it.
And then we invented a vocoder, so I think that was the first vocoder, now used a lot by everyone, but this was our advertisement. Right. A lot of bands use these. I mean, Pink Floyd is one of the sort of good examples. They had bought lots of them. Every time that they bought something, then I could do some more experiments.
Working with sort of colours of light, so you know what you're doing is actually our, I suppose, perspective was to take people on trips without taking LSD.
Some of these musicians would actually be tripping when they first encountered the synthesizer, and I think that what was happening to these musicians is that it was, you know, part of the 60s classic thing for, you know, expanding your consciousness, and here was this wonderful new instrument that could almost take you on this magical trip, and you never knew quite for sure what you were going to get out of this instrument. It was very capricious. You'd mess around with it. Some of the sounds were horrible, could be a bad trip, and some of the sounds would just sort of be heavenly and would be just beautiful and take you away. And I think the performers of the synthesizer, they described the VCS3 in particular, which had an incredible range of sounds, as like acid, sort of like an electronic form of the drug acid.
We used to record a lot of our earlier albums under the influence of LSD, because we used to reckon that all the sound frequencies that we used to get were key sort of little things on when people were tripping, they'd feel the same thing as what we did. So yeah, that's what we used to do in the early days. Obviously, as you get older, you stop taking it, of course, I might add, you know.
Because we had very, very revolutionary equipment and a very revolutionary studio, we attracted top people of all kinds.
As a result of which they started adopting some of the ideas that had up to that point been very much in the sort of the boutique electronic studio. Slowly people's soundscape was expanding, first of all through feedback of Jimi Hendrix. Suddenly people realized, hey, this is a new way of experiencing sound, and, you know, bands that we're into, like the Pink Floyd doing it, it sort of crept up.
So, There's my studio. I don't know why it's there really, but still. All right, here's a new type of computer. I was very, very interested, and I still am, in the way of producing scores. So I hope this will pause. This says, please make me a beautiful composition. The next is, after a bit, the computer answers with some sort of sounds and says, this is a beautiful composition. But do you know if it is? So you ask the computer back, is this a beautiful composition? And the computer, of course, says, do you think it is? And you have to answer, I suppose it is, you've made it. And the only answer you could do then is to say, please make me another beautiful composition. And so I think that this is about the most succinct computer music score you could have of those initials. On the other hand, behind this frivolous idea, I did have the idea that you could make a tetrahedron coming back again to triangles, and you could slice the tetrahedron, and at that point in the tetrahedron you'd have areas of tension like expectation, surprise, grayness, dependency, tension. And wherever you cut this tetrahedron, you would have a score where you would obey those emotional rules. So that was a very sort of ambitious idea, but this is what computers would be able to do.
But that image is very almost like cutting through strata in rock again, isn't it?
Again, it is, yes, exactly. So now we're going on to the structure of Act 3, based on the tides, which you saw at the beginning. There's the crystal again.
In England.
Oh, we've got a bit more first.
Queen Elizabeth Hall, the first concert in Britain given by a computer.
The next item, Partita for Unattended Computer by Peter Zinovieff, is a true live performance in the sense that no magnetic tape is being used at all. Furthermore, the computer has a choice at various stages in the procedure, and the piece therefore comes out different every time it's played. The performance you're about to hear is therefore unique and unrepeatable. First of all, checks are made to see that the composition is correctly loaded into the computer. The computer is started and will carry out the performance unattended.
That's now becoming famous, Delia Derbyshire starting it, who was my colleague, and there we had it sort of sitting on the stage of Queen Elizabeth Hall. It was a ridiculous idea.
The audience is a capacity one, but the computer's performance didn't meet with universal approval. The Financial Times said, technically, it may be a triumph of skill and knowledge, but what we heard resembled the dreariest kind of neo-Weber drawn out to inordinate length.
What we were making was very
Neo-Weber, that was fantastic.
Things like that. On the other hand, if you were a technician, you'd realize that into those simple sounds had gone a huge amount of effort. The computer was actually controlling sound equipment, the sound equipment was controlling an amplifier, and out it came all by itself. This was incredible technology for those days.
And I've got the reviews, some of which were a bit scathing, you know, and some of them were saying, well, it's an interesting noise, but it's not music.
So, this was the studio when I went to Oxford with it. So, that's roughly what the computer side of it looked like. Show it to you again, wait. Oh. All right, so that was all the paper tape, the printer. That was the computer setup. Okay, so now, these are more modern experiments. Oh, does that show? Yes. This is a very good quest. Waveform to MIDI. This is a wild experiment. This is a picture advertising a Cambridge University alumni travel program, which my wife did. And I wondered if you scan it into Sibelius, what sort of sounds could you get out of that instead of from a score? So what do you think that picture could give you? Do people here use Sibelius? Yeah. Score writing. All right. So this is using the scanning option from that picture. So it's found the bow. And it's found points. There was a wonderful picture in a magazine called Source, I'll go back, called Source, again, in the 1970s, very lavish American magazine. And there was a bloke with a huge bit of manuscript paper about 50 yards away, and he had a machine gun. And he was shooting at the score. And so there would be bullet holes. And then he'd reduce the score, and that's what people would play. So that was the same sort of experiment. This is just to show how really amazing that, for me, a few years ago, it seemed amazing that you could get somebody just to play a piano, and whatever they played would, in front of our eyes, become a score. I mean, this is... I'm very involved at the moment with this. I'm working with a marvelous violinist, and she's playing... This is too loud. She's playing directly into Sibelius. Right.
Every home has a very powerful computer, many millions of times.
All right, I've done that, so now I'm going to go on. So here's a synthesizer which is here. This is an older model of it, which anyone can play with afterwards. And here are some programs which I'm using at the moment. Some of these are being developed for me by York University, and this is part of a piece I'm doing for a sculpture in Istanbul later this year. So here we have again this quest of waveform to MIDI. So here's Beethoven being converted into a MIDI file. And here's an artificial, this is my Jenny there, this is an artificial singing program. So there's a rough melody, and that could be transformed. That Beethoven symphony can be transformed. And here I'm just using N-Track to collect a few things from what we've been hearing together. There's the MIDI file of Beethoven. And my whippet and other things will now come together. That's the vocal part. This is my That's part of a Hensa, but distorted. And at the back is still my whippet's heart going bum bum. And the Beethoven dribbling along. So All right, now we'll move on to the last part which is the libretto. So here's part of a Mask of Orpheus. Was originally for Covent Garden, but in the end it, via Glyndebourne, ended up at the English National Opera. So here are the tides, which you've seen before, both on the Isle of Rasay and outside my house in Putney in London, where my first studio was. Sometimes the studio would even flood from the Thames when it got high. So water and tides have always been, it's always been terrible, really.
It might be worth explaining who Harrison Birtwistle is, because I'm sure some people here won't know.
Well, he's probably our most distinguished British composer. And he's called Harrison Birtwistle. So this is part of a structure of this libretto. It's not just a question of writing words and then singers singing them. It also is a very contrived, artificial thing, really. Here, for instance, I imagine that on the beach are various objects, like a bit of fishing net, an old bit of bone, an old fossil or something, and the tide comes up and covers each of these objects, and then the tide falls and uncovers these objects. Each time that they're covered or uncovered, it triggers off a whole dramatic scene, a whole sort of perhaps the death of Orpheus or the rebirth of Orpheus or a song. And so this structure of the tides falling and rising is the structure of the whole of the Act 3, which is about an hour long in this opera. And in the same way, the actual staging, the type of masks which people wear, the gestures which they make, everything is dependent on this thing of a tide moving up and down and up again.
Is that like a dedicated sign language there, or is that something that you came up with?
It's something I came up with. That's to represent the main protagonists in the opera. And in the same way that it becomes so away from language that I invented a special language for them to speak. I used the words Orpheus and Eurydice, and out of these syllables, I made a language which had its own context and grammar and tenses and vocabulary, and it had to be written. I used an IBM typewriter because there weren't word processors in those days, and overlapped the letters so that when the singers had to sing them, they looked at something incomprehensible as well as, so the language was incomprehensible in all sorts of ways. I don't know if one can see there, but the translation of English to Orphic, yeah, you can see is very complicated, but there is, although it's simple, I mean, Orpheus might sing something like, I can see an oar on the shore, but what he would say is, or something which has never been sung before and is untranslatable except as a notion. So here we have, this is a song in this invented language. This is by Philip Langridge, who died 3 days ago. this is- So although this is an English opera, one can't understand what these words are. And it's very difficult, the idea of inventing a new thing to sing, because these are professional singers and they have to learn it by heart. And okay, so that's the end of that.
So you kind of use these professional singers as professional components in you synthesizing a language, basically.
Yeah, they had to sing it. You know, it's an opera. This is a proper full-scale opera. So this is what I'm involved in now. It's for this sculpture, which is on its way to Istanbul from here. It is in Seville, and what I'm doing is taking Bartók in about 1930, the late 1930s, recorded a lot of folk songs in Turkey. This is my origins, a Russian troika, and that's the end of this little demonstration. But I would now answer any questions about any of these slides or go back to them, whatever. Thank you.
Yeah, I guess before we open it up, there's like maybe a few questions lying around. Okay, the saucy ones first. Did we hear that right? Delia Derbyshire was your assistant at some stage.
Yes, I formed a...
Lucky you.
I formed a group called Unit Delta Plus, and I got Delia Derbyshire and Brian Hodgson from the BBC to join me in that.
Right. Were they doing the radiophonic workshop then already, or?
They left the radiophonic workshop to join me.
Okay.
I mean, the idea was that we would make a fortune doing commercial sounds. Yeah. And I wasn't interested in doing commercial sounds. We did one commercial sound for Philips, which was something like whoop, and that was it. And we got a lot of money for that. But I didn't want to do that. I didn't want to do that. So so we split after a bit, and they went on, but they didn't succeed either. It's, you know, I didn't want to have a commercial studio. I wanted to have an experimental studio where good composers could work and not pay. In fact, rather like this organization, it was the same sort of philosophy that if anybody had a good project, they could come and work in my studio and I wouldn't charge them. Right. And so quite a lot of, it wasn't just Henser and Birtwistle who came, but we had often Arts Council courses, and perhaps 20 people would come and study over a month or whatever it was. And so in that way, it is very similar to Red Bull, I think.
Now, obviously, we can only judge it in retrospect and are kind of amazed when we watch documentaries on the radiophonic workshop. But can you...
I'm amazed too. I mean, because these archive films I had no idea until a few years ago existed. So it's extraordinary for me to look and think, this is actually what happened.
But can you recall like what these people and what they were doing in a very public environment, actually, and publicly funded as well, at the time, and how that was perceived by you and your likes, and maybe the general public?
What?
Like the radiophonic workshop.
Well, the radiophonic workshop was really purely for sound effects in radio. Yeah. So that's what it did. It's become famous really because of a Doctor Who thing, but otherwise, you know, it was a very primitive tape studio, and it wasn't in any way a research studio. And they bought, for instance, EMS equipment and other equipment. But it was never an advanced studio in the same sort of way as Cologne was, or Utrecht, or Columbia. And it wasn't in any way an academic or as I say, a research studio, yeah.
Who were your other customers at the time? Because, I mean, you mentioned a few educational or broadcasting facilities that were kind of like mixed roles. And, I mean, the Cologne facility, as Professor Potmore would be able to tell you, is still like this bizarre museum that no one is able to get into, really. And but I mean, massive chunks of money were sunk into these places. But who else could afford these things?
Well, mainly radio stations. Radio stations and a few universities bought, well, everybody bought little ones like this, but the big Synthi 100s, which was a bigger version of this. I mean, perhaps somebody could hold this up. Would you like to come and hold this up so people can see what, or the other way around? No, not to me. I mean to...
No, I'm just trying to, I just want to be gently.
All right. So we made, this was a Synthi A, very primitive one, first one. And we made a huge version of this called the Synthi 100. And I think we made 30 or 40 or something like that of those.
Do you know how many of those are still around? Because we obviously only know the pictures.
Now, I want to find, if anybody knows of one secretly, I'll pay them some money because I know I can sell it for a fortune.
I mean, I saw one on the internet that went for like a 6-digit figure.
Yeah, well, that's it. I know, I think, I'm not going to tell where I think there are some, sort of people talking Orphic, So...
what do you make? I mean, it's a German company that's now doing...
There is, yes, Ludwig Rehberg. Yeah. He was my German agent. And he still... In fact, Robin Wood, who was my studio assistant, now owns EMS, and he's just about to start up remaking a batch of VCS3s. Nice. Just exactly the same as the originals, but they're going to cost a fortune. The whole idea of the original machine was it would be very cheap, and any musician could buy one, sort of.
Yeah, but I mean, £330, I think it said in the ad that you had in one of these
clips. For a
clips.
VCS3, was it? Yes.
Yeah. I mean, but at the time, that's obviously a totally different £330 than now, right? What would that have...
Mini cost 800. That's when a mini car cost about 5 or 6 or
half the price of a car. That's not
but on the but you can't really compare it because there weren't very many electronic things then. Yeah. So it's...
Yeah, but when you say like you wanted every musician to be able to buy it, I mean, in the end, it was people that were in bands like The Who or Pink Floyd or whatever. Who had
well, we sold several thousand. Yeah. So there were several thousand people who did buy them, and it was the same sort of price as the Moogs in America, and hundreds of thousands bought those. So I think one has to think that after all, a pocket calculator cost a lot of money. A telephone cost a fortune. A mobile telephone was very expensive. So the fact that these things are much cheaper now doesn't mean that people wouldn't have bought them then, I think.
But still, how do you feel now that obviously, even up until like the late 90s, like having the actual financial funds to obtain a physical unit was like a big threshold for many people in doing music, whereas now it's more the matter of like finding free Wi-Fi and a $300 computer.
Well, even the programs for a computer are still quite expensive.
Yeah, but it's a lot easier to find another version of that than, stealing a physical unit. Right? So
well, let's say that you have a powerful enough computer now to run a good computer synthesis program and have MIDI input and all the things that you want. You're up to quite a lot of money. It's not really, you couldn't just spend £500. You need a lot of data storage, you need a lot of peripherals. So what would it cost? £2,000? £2,500?
I guess most of the people in here would do stuff on a standard unit that's below a grand, just below a grand.
What, with input and amplifiers? And
amplification,
speakers?
okay, amplification is a different thing.
well,
but most
have
people use the headphones, I guess, if you look around, yeah? Yeah, but yeah, I mean,
So
obviously-
what you're doing here is really the answer, isn't it? To have lots of recording suites for people to be able to come and go and do it. This is the answer. To have high-class equipment, it's much better to have limited facilities of very good equipment than to have a lot of bad equipment going around. And also on headphones, you say, but you can't really hear what it's going to sound like. And also the better, the higher quality programs you use, the better facility, the more you can do with it. And still, even now, you know, it's nothing like the end. It's only beginning what you can do with computers. I mean, the programs are terribly primitive. All of these mixing programs and the stuff you can do with MIDI, or MIDI itself is incredibly naive. Sampling is still naive. It's still like a beginning of electronic music, I think, what's happening.
Something that's sometimes I feel a little bit overlooked when we talk about the history of synthesis is that we're mostly looking for getting that warm sound or that original sound and that kind of stuff. But most of these units strike most when you get in touch with them the first time, that they actually do have like an inherent rhythm within them, that a lot of the sounds do provide you with some rhythmic element straight away. Let's say if you apply like some sort of a modulation to an oscillator.
What's the opposite of no rhythm?
I don't know, silence maybe? So, yeah, but the interesting thing is like most people would just go like, oh yeah, I want to get that sound, like a single hit note, like a one-shot note. But most of synthesized sounds actually do have like a lot of movement within them, and a lot of the beauty that lies within using analog equipment is that you can actually manipulate the very parameters of that rhythm a lot more directly than, let's say, on a computer screen.
Do you think that's true?
I'd agree with you. I think that's true. The thing I find with something like the AKS and the VCS3 is that all the parameters that are out there for you to touch immediately. If you're using a mouse or a trackpad, you can only touch one parameter at a time. So you've got much more access to all the parts of the machine, much more directly. And you can play with any number of them simultaneously, which is much more difficult with the current state of the digital equipment.
I think you're right. I think it is. David Cockerell, who you've seen a lot in those pictures, I wanted him to make an implant into my arm, which in those days, this is a long time ago, would purely control a voltage-controlled oscillator. So I thought that I would be able to think high note, and out would come a high note. Now, there's no reason why not. Absolutely none. One could train ones to train them, but I couldn't find a doctor to do it. I mean, that's true. I mean, he designed a thing, but I couldn't find. So
maybe you could have put it in the whippet.
Maybe, but I think what you're saying is right, that it would be much better to have a multi-sensory input, in which case you don't need to have a physical thing, because we've only got 2 hands and 5 fingers on each. So it would be much better to have, say, a direct thought. I'm not joking here. Direct thought to computer control.
Yeah, I'm sure you're pretty aware of this, but there's like lots of experiments on this for like the last 30, 40 years.
Yep.
And they found in the end that like the currents that are used in the brain are just too low, so that the amplitude wouldn't be big enough for the pickups to recognize the differences, so far at least.
Yeah, but that's direct brain rhythm. Yeah. But I'm not talking about, I'm talking about muscular.
So you're still consciously controlling some
your
part
thought
of your body.
controls. Yeah, you learn to. I mean, just in the same way as you learn to open, you can learn to control this muscle. You only have to have a slight change in voltage to have the highest to lowest frequency, say, and you can have several of these, just like in the same way as you can move different fingers.
But would the advantage be really that big if you, because like the brain information to going into making this finger move and turn something.
You'd be able to turn 100.
Okay. Do we got a scientist in the house? Can we work on this one now? Like,
I think so. Anyway, we can't forecast. I'm talking in the same way as, this is 200 years ago, what I'm talking about here. I'm talking about in 200 years, another 200 years. That's in, say, 2015, or whatever the acceleration is.
so you're basically suggesting for us all to start going out with like neuroscientists and like get some intel for.
Is there anybody here who'd be up for such experiments?
Yeah.
Surely the space dimension control it.
Well, another synthesizer kind of inventor, Kurzweil. Ray Kurzweil, I'm sure you're probably familiar with his work. He's talking about the same thing with scanning of the brain and Wi-Fi connecting to your synthesizer or whatever via the chip in your head. Like it seems like it's an idea that lots of people are talking about. I don't have a question.
I don't want it in my head. I want it somewhere else, nose perhaps. But anyway, I mean, I do think that computer music is really only beginning. It's made huge advances from the first Music 5 programs, which was the first computer music synthesis programs. And it's advancing all the time. I think there's going through a rather static phase at the moment because people think of producing these polished, so you use the same sort of programs to produce these polished nuggets of sound without enough scope for wild experiments. It's my feeling. I mightn't be right. But who's inventing completely new programs which don't use MIDI, say? York University is one, but...
Is Trevor Wishart still at York University? Is that who you work with at York?
No, this is... I don't. This sculpture, which I showed you, is financed by... the Morning Line financed a whole new research department for several £1 million at York University, and under Tony Myatt. And it's an annex to it. It's got fantastic facilities, very, very good recording studios, and it's sort of state of the art in Britain, I think.
Another question over there?
Yeah. You'll have to excuse me. I'm going to kind of gush for a second, but I found your kind of mapping of the libretto and all that stuff extremely freaky, because like when I was a kid and trying to figure out how to produce, I noticed that all of my favorite tracks on records were always number 7, and I figured there needed to be a reason for that. So I would listen to records with a Cartesian plane and at time, and then the Y value would be like, if it was a rock record, how much did it rock, or how much, or if it was a soul record, how soulful was it? And I came up with the exact same curve in some of the best albums of all time. And then in my later years, I was doing film school and learning about classical story structure and stuff, and it's the exact same curve. It's freaky shit.
Well, number 7 is, of course, 777, Aleister Crowley book. I mean, 7 is the magic number of all magic numbers, so it doesn't surprise me.
Anyway, my question, or my first of many questions, we'll see how much time there is, but is in experiments of me trying to impose this curve upon my music and writing and cooking, whatever. you know, you don't come up with the perfect album. I mean, there's something to be said for the non-quantifiable thing that makes, like, you have perfect albums that adhere to this perfect curve, but then there's something. How do you in your experiments account for the unquantifiable thing that is just like, that makes it beautiful, that makes it
inspiration? I think that comes back to my Geiger counter and the luminous watch and random numbers. Very, very important is to tame randomness. So although there is a randomness, you tame this into the direction which you want it. So there's the unexpected. So you do not quite know how it's this is what inspiration is taming the unexpected. And the unexpected can only come from randomness.
So, when you're, say, composing or writing, how do you introduce randomness into composing a?
I suppose just allow it to. You know, it's a poet would surely say that there's a random element in what comes to him to write down on the paper. Every word cannot be preordained by himself. It must be, there's a good idea. So where does the good idea come from? Maybe the sunshine, or in my case, the rising tide. You know, there's the tides moving up and down were an incredibly good inspiration for this pattern. You know, and that's fluke. That is the randomness, I think. You have to let yourself open to let these things come in.
So one of the points we were talking about earlier on about why synthesizers like the Synthi A are becoming popular again these days is that because of their analog nature, there is a degree of randomness in there.
Yes,
they
exactly.
behave. Whereas when you put in the right number in the right box in your digital synth that you're running as a piece of software in your computer, it just does exactly that. And the slightly random nature of the little bit of grit that's on the carbon track in the pot is where the inspiration comes from for a lot of people who've grown up completely working in music in the digital domain.
Yes, I think you're right. But in my new life as doing electronic music again, which is, you know, a really lucky new life. I wasn't doing it until a few years ago. And now I find that using real sounds is where the randomness comes in. So in those bits I played you, each of the samples is a different sample. So there is the randomness. But the trouble with these, I find that with synthesizers, I sort of know the sound, and it feels too repetitive to me. And where is the gigantic sort of random sound of, say, an orchestra? You know, an orchestra, no piece of music by live people, live performers, is ever the same, is it? You take a bit of sheet music, and there's no two performances of it ever in the whole history of that sheet music which are identical. So this translation from a score or an idea is completely amazing, that what happens in music. So I think what you were talking about is that's the essence of music, is that there's always something unexpected. And what you were saying about the randomness, that, you know, no vibrato on a violin is ever the same as the previous one.
Another question, and another thing that was about this whole discussion that's been freaky for me is I've also done similar experiments with, like, I had a little G2M MIDI or audio to MIDI converter box. It's meant for playing monophonic guitar lines, but I would put random found sounds into it and see what my synthesizer would play based on these things, and it was just rubbish. But now there's a company called Melodyne that has announced that you can that you'll be able to sample a chord and then break it down into its parts.
Well, you
and
can
adjust them
already.
in the
Is it Melodyne 2, which they're just producing the next version, Melodyne 3, I think it is. But Melodyne 2, you can do that already. But
I've seen
that
it
just allows you to shift and move the chords or stretch them apart. Yeah, it's an amazing program. But I'm amazed how that example I showed you of Beethoven being transformed into recognizable. I can't remember what it was. Tubular bells I chose. All right, but it's still recognizable as Beethoven, although it's waveform to MIDI. I mean, it's completely extraordinary.
I think there's a question over here.
Sorry, I'm just going to jump in between quickly. It seems that we were talking a little bit about the sounds of synthesizers and the kind of randomness in sound that we all, I think a lot of us, really seek after the older gear because we like that character to it. We're talking. You also kind of touched on the MIDI thing and converting actual audio to MIDI and that kind of thing. Do you foresee that there will ever be a time that you can digitize the sound of an instrument so that it's kind of... I mean, I think a lot of the older analog like the really early experiments when you hear, I don't know, like the Mellotron choir and stuff like that was the closest that we ever got to the pleasing sound, but converted to an electronic kind of thing. And but now it seems that MIDI signals, they're very... I don't know, they seem so far away from the actual feeling of real instruments.
Well, I've had a lot of lovely pianos in my life, and I've now got a Yamaha CLP 170, and it's got I think it's a Steinway sampled piano, which it plays back. And it's a lovely, lovely piano, so I can control it by MIDI, and out comes this synthetic but sampled real piano, and it's a lovely sound. And you'd be hard pushed to say that this wasn't a piano. And the same really with the new Sibelius orchestra sounds. They're very good in the new version. The instrumental sounds are extraordinary. I mean, especially the sampled ones. So I think you can get real sounds, and this will improve. Of course, the samples, the actual amount of gigabytes you need for the samples is large, and so when space becomes faster and memory even better than now, then these, it won't matter how big the samples are, and you'll be able to synthesize very realistic sounds. I think. Does anyone agree? Yep.
Yeah, that was kind of that was kind of where I was going with that. A computer is always going to be, X amount of numbers, however high you set the parameters. But and that's the kind of I think some of the beauty in the early synthesizers that we all love is that, again, even though you're creating an electronic sound, there's still that beauty of the randomness and something that you can't put your finger on. And I was just kind of interested, is there ever going to be a point in time where a computer can maybe somehow, do that?
Well, if you think that your head is in a way a computer, can you think when you listen to sounds in your head, do you hear them differently each time?
Probably.
Yeah. So the answer is yes.
Hello. 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 You were saying that you were giving us the example when you used an image and transform it into a score on Sibelius, and obviously we've been talking about randomness and the importance of randomness in music. But how do you balance the randomness and the order? Because how do you suggest that we use these devices and you gave the example of the score. So, okay, I have this score that is random based on the image. How do I make it into a piece of work of my own from that point?
Well, I hope that you're going to tell me. I mean, it's not, that's what we're all on about, isn't it? That's what we want to do. But there isn't an answer to your question. There are a million ways of doing it, aren't there?
Okay.
I think. I mean, it'd be wonderful if I could say, "You want that secret?" and I give you a piece of paper. You know, I would love to have such a piece of paper.
I have another question. It's a bit technical, but you were mentioning the Geiger counter because I guess the algorithms that were being used back then are still more or less the same, are still ring based and need a seed. And how exactly would you insert the numbers, the random numbers from the Geiger counter?
Well, you'd have to have a sampler which would sample the number of clicks given off the Geiger counter, and from that derive a number. And then you'd have a list of numbers, an ever-generating list of numbers.
Yeah, then you
and then you can tame those numbers in whatever way you like.
And it repeats, the sequence repeats itself after...
No, the sequence would never repeat. It would always be coming out forever.
Yeah, because you're constantly using a different...
Yes, because it comes out all the time. So you would have a USB Geiger counter, you know, and out comes the random numbers, and then just with easy mathematics, you can choose what to do with those numbers.
Okay.
There's a new
you use a modulo and the remainder.
This was a big device in 1960, you know. So now it would be very easy to do it, and I think you could have a tiny. I don't think anybody's made one, but it would be very nice to have a little USB plug like this.
I think there is. They've been using on online casinos to generate the sequences. Yeah.
Oh, you can get the sequences, I'm sure, but it'd be nice to have this self-contained, so it's your own sequence, not from somebody else. Because if you can get it online, somebody else can use that sequence.
Yes.
So it's no longer random.
It's never totally random, but for your purpose, if you only need a certain...
But if there were 20 of us, we'd have the same...
Oh, yeah, yes, that's true. Okay.
There's a
That's
question over there.
I have a question over here.
Yeah.
You got it, right?
Sorry, there's one over there as well. So can we somehow match Geiger counters and our personal DNA, and that way be like totally independent there?
Yeah, I had read about the morning line.
Oh, good.
Yeah, I'm over here. I had read about the morning line a month before coming here, and I think isn't it a collaboration installation with various artists from Spain? I believe.
Yeah, there are five people, 5 composers who did it in Seville where it opened. Yeah. And now there's another 5 who are doing it in Istanbul.
Oh, so they're kind of doing a different version of it in Istanbul.
Yes, so each time, it's a really fantastic extravagance. Yeah. This sculpture costs £100,000 to be refurbished. It costs £100,000 to move. So it's moving, it must have moved now from Seville to Northampton in Britain to be recovered and rewired and refurbished. Then it costs £100,000 to send it to Istanbul. And in Istanbul, it's going to last, I don't know, a few months, a year, 2. And then it will cost another £100,000 to send where it's forever.
Yeah.
With another lot of composers. It's one of the most extravagant, wild, artistic gestures that has been done.
And I read a bit about it, and I heard that it has to do a lot with randomness and especially fractals in nature. The actual sculpture.
The sculpture, yes.
Yeah, and there was actually this one artist that really interests me, Roque Jiménez de Cisneros, from Spain, I believe, Barcelona. And he's doing some really interesting electronic music that with recording the gas horns in York University. Maybe you've...
Yes.
Yeah. And it's pretty weird because he's doing the electronic compositions like with dealing with a lot of randomness, and then replicating that same randomness but in a totally non-synthesized way, just like with gas horns, and actually doing physical, like how would you do with a synthesizer only in the physical realm. So do you believe that's maybe like a tendency towards maybe doing maybe post-electronic music that it's not actually electronic, and just like using organic means to make different sounds that we probably heard in nature but not really? Do you believe that's a tendency?
Yes, but then immediately it's recorded. It's like samples, so it is electronic.
Oh yeah, but I mean, it doesn't really have to be recorded. I mean, it could just be replicated because he does it live, the performances.
Yes.
But yeah, there are some MP3s floating around. But yeah, you're right about that.
But you don't have the lion or the birds unless you recorded them. I mean, it would be difficult to have them there and then. But originally, this sculpture was going to come this year to the Queen Elizabeth Hall in London. And this is why it's this shape. But then the South Bank decided that it was too difficult to put wheelchair access to it, so they refused it. So, which is why it's going to Istanbul.
And just another question. So most of the digital audio workstations we use nowadays are very Western in the sense that all the sequences are just left to right, just like how we write in the Western world. Do you think there's maybe going to be a backlash towards that?
I do hope so, because it's terrible. They all look alike. They're all very similar. They, one person will say it's like Apple versus PC. It's I use one, I use the other. It would be marvelous if there was a revolution in that, so it was a completely different concept of a score, left to right like that. Yes.
Yes, because I believe a lot of young artists, like me included, are just like putting all their ideas into these kinds of programs, and I mean, in a sense, you have to learn how to use a program instead of just like letting the ideas flow.
I agree with you. I mean, I can imagine that a sort of spherical interface would be better, something which is more tactile than, I mean, coming back perhaps to this, but as an interface to a computer thing. So, whereas those linear doors are sort of very, very frustrating, really.
Yes, I can't even work with structure. It's really hard for me.
Yes, you're right.
Aren't you using Ableton anyway?
Yeah.
But then you're going into like a different dimension straight away, aren't you?
Well, yeah. I mean, you can do it vertically, but I mean, just for me, it's like I don't really know how to structure stuff. So, I don't know. Maybe it's because I come from a different background of non-pop music. So.
Perhaps it would be good if there was a different scale, which you could see. You could see the whole thing overall in a different three-dimensional way, or something, and use that. I think it needs a revolution. I mean, why don't you write a program?
Yeah,
seriously.
I'm not really good at coding. I mean, I've been trying to learn programming for quite a while now, but it's just like it baffles me. It's too abstract.
You need David Cockrell, as it were, in your field. You have a concept, and you need somebody to
channel it,
to screw it up, as it were.
Yeah.
Well, we can put it online with this lecture now. You got your request, and we just put your email address.
Anybody
on the stream.
wanna?
Well, that's exactly what happened to me with some of the interviews in this, which was for an Australian film called "What the Future Sounded Like," I think, and. At the end of it, I said, I wish I could find somebody to work with. And immediately, this Morning Line thing came up, and York University came up with these new things for me, just because of his film. So that's what you must do, is to broadcast it, and you'll find that people will come and help you.
Okay. What email address should we put in there?
Please contact Moises Horta at I don't know, _h@hotmail.com.
That's the deal, yeah.
I can't pay you, so I can give you some beer, maybe. Thank you.
Hi. Have you, by any chance, read a book called Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance? Over here.
I have a long time ago.
Yeah, I was looking at it the other day, and there's sort of a concept that it's talking about of classic thought versus romantic thought, where classic is very much about the underlying form and how this thing works and getting really into the nitty-gritty and breaking it down all the parts you can get, and the romantic side is just like, it sounds good, cool, that's lovely, I like it, sort of thing, essentially. And I don't know if you kind of covered this on what you were talking about before of sort of chaos versus order kind of thing and randomness and stuff, but you obviously have a brilliant mind and you're able to invent a language and invent synthesis, and that's pretty amazing. But how do you translate the music that you make into something that can, from all the knowledge that you have of all the breakdown parts, into something that can sound kind of have a sense of beauty? No, I'm not saying that your stuff isn't beautiful, but how would you approach that?
I don't know. No idea. So it's...
Okay. It's fair enough. It's probably one of the best lessons to know when you say, I don't know.
I mean, there is an interesting point, is that a friend over here touched on earlier on about he doesn't come necessarily from a popular music background, and so his approach to the sequences or whatever is different. I mean, to some degree, one of the reasons that you're appreciated by this crowd is because of your work that's had a massive influence in popular culture more than in high art, university, academic culture. For what you're working on now, or what is interesting you now, can you see how that will have an influence on popular culture, on commercial culture?
No, because it's really just a fluke that at my age I've got this sort of opportunity of trying out these new techniques again with the knowledge of what it used to be like, and so therefore it's, in a way, I have an advantage of being able to jump in and not care. But only if I could gather people like that together to...
Well, you've got his email address now. So.
Well, I haven't, but you must give it to me. And will you give me your email address? Write it down? Yes. But, I mean, it's people like him who have to think of how best to revolutionize what the state of play is at the moment. And that's what people like David Cockerell did with, they were able to say, yes, I can do that out of a concept.
But do you feel that is something that remains in academic culture, or that is something that will have much greater repercussions in popular culture?
I think it must be popular culture because, as you said, so many people now are able to synthesize music. But in a way, it's like saying a lot of people can have a piano, but it doesn't mean there's a lot of good pianists. But piano is very clever in that it's got a wonderful format. So you can use all your fingers and all sorts of things. It's a wonderful format. And I don't think that there is yet this wonderful format for making inventive electronic music. And that's what you were saying, really, isn't it? That there isn't such a wonderful device for controlling your thoughts into it.
Yeah, like my question was just about improvisation as an electronic musician, but I guess that's the answer. There isn't. I mean, you're programming. You're not performing necessarily.
And that's why I showed you that score at the beginning, which has got these grand ideas like surprise, tension, greyness, dependency on what's happened. These are the notions of inspiration to a music score. But it hasn't been done yet, but it will.
So do you think that if you had more control, you talked about the implant or whatever, that if you had complete control but going back to what Moises was saying, and a different way of approaching electronic music, that you would be able to kind of express yourself in the same way that like a concert pianist obviously can with that device, but in a kind of a different, in the electronic realm.
Perhaps you could, or my great-grandchildren, but I couldn't, no.
But do you think that's kind of the next level of
yes,
the improvisational level of electronic music?
I think it must be. It must be. But again, it depends on having a good input device, which is subtler than a mouse and a typewriter keyboard. That's terrible.
What about the already existing tactile?
Well, there's still sort of, they're monosyllabic in a way, aren't they?
Well, there's already multi-touch controllers.
Well, this magazine which I mentioned, Source magazine, which if you can look in your music libraries, they're wonderful, wonderful, extravagant magazines, thick with records, records in them. With one of them is a page with different materials and animal furs and things, and you touch it, and you touch for different things, and you think music. It's a music score. So this is brilliant. So it's, you close your eyes and you touch different things, and this is the score. So you have a page laid out with these things to touch. And that's what I mean. How do you use these different tactile things to make what our friend wants is a good input program? Maybe, anyway, all that's for you to do.
And what about the use of mocap, motion capture?
What about it?
Just like you put markers on your arms, and with the infrared cameras, you can take the movement that you make and then translate the movement into MIDI messages that could go to images and to sound.
Yeah, but it will be the language which, all right, you've got 100 mice and you're a good dancer and you've got 20 infrared cameras and you've got this massive information there. But that doesn't mean because you've got a mass of tactile or movement information that you make good music, does it? I mean, what is the translation between one and the other?
Well, I just thought that maybe instead of using implants, like motion capture could be like...
it sounds wonderful. I'd love to hear your piece and see it, because it would be visual as well.
I can afford to get like markers and but
yeah, thank you.
There's another one over there. And then I guess what we do is maybe break it up as far as like those who are interested. Support me over there would give a little demo of the unit, and then the rest of you will be relieved for your lunch break. But
released.
No, I mean I can see totally the division between people that are absolutely into it and others like, what planet are we on right now?
Sorry to keep bringing it back over this corner, but in terms of all the things we've just kind of touched on, different controllers and giving you more control over a variety of different sounds. Do you still think that within all those things, if you had an implant controller or whatever you're using, mocap, like any of those things, how would you make it so that you had complete control over the sounds and that you weren't still confined by the bounds of, say, Western harmony? Or
I have to return the question. It's up to you. I've got no idea how you would do that. How could I possibly know? These are unknown techniques to me, and it's future is in your hands, boy, as they say in Scotland.
Well, maybe you heard it all here first.
But good luck.
Yeah, I guess that's probably the perfect end, and the future is all in all your hands. And I guess you will all join me in thanking Dr. Peter Zinovieff.